Hi, this is the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI, and I'm your host, Yaakov Katz. Canada seems to be on fire. In the last year, since October 7th, the country has seen a staggering 670% rise in reported anti-Semitic incidents. Here are just some examples. Shots were fired in May at the Beis Chaya Mushka Elementary School in Toronto. Last week, the Shari Torah synagogue in the same city was vandalized after a window had been smashed there also in May. The Talmud Torah Elementary School in Montreal was hit by gunfire last November, and in Vancouver, an explosive device detonated in the entryway of the Shari Tzedek synagogue. And then there's what happened last month in Montreal. At the 70th annual session of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, rioters organized by a couple of groups against Israel wreaked havoc on the city. They ignited smoke bombs, threw metal barriers onto the streets, smashed windows, all where the NATO delegates were meeting. The rioters torched cars and they even burned an effigy of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. What's happening there and why? To discuss this, there's probably no one better suited than our guest, Professor Irwin Cotler. Professor Cotler is a former Justice Minister of Canada, is the international chair of the Royal Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He's a leading human rights advocate and lawyer on behalf of dissidents from across the globe, and he was Canada's special envoy to combat anti-Semitism until just a few days after October 7th. And most recently, and we'll talk a bit about this, it was revealed that Canada had even foiled a plot by Iran to assassinate Professor Cotler, no less. So, Professor Cotler, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining. And I'll start with what is going on in Canada that we're seeing this crazy explosion of anti-Semitism.
Well, the word you just used, the explosion of anti-Semitism, was the subject of a 8,000-page, very authoritative piece that was just published by a distinguished Canadian journalist, Terry Glavin, on December 11th, the day after Human Rights Day. And the connection I make here is because Human Rights Day, the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, speaks about barbaric acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. Well, that's exactly what occurred in the mass atrocities of October 7th, perpetrated not only by the terrorist organization Hamas under Canadian law, American law, European law, etc., but by an anti-Semitic genocidal terrorist organization, not because I say so, but because they say so, have affirmed in their charter of 1988 and since, and after October 7th, committed themselves to commit such mass atrocities again, again, and again. Now, one would have thought that this type of globalized mass atrocities, as I say, outrages that shocked, barbaric acts shocked the conscience of mankind, this would have resulted in a uniform condemnation of anti-Semitism. This would have resulted in action against anti-Semitism here in Canada and elsewhere. On the contrary, what we saw has been, as you put it, an unprecedented explosion of anti-Semitism. And what's worse has been the denial that these acts even took place, or the silence in the face of them taking place, or the support for them, the justification of them, the glorification of them, the celebration of them. And we're finding this in the public squares in Canada, in the campus community, demonstrations outside Parliament here. So this explosion has been accompanied by ongoing mass demonstrations glorifying, as I say, not only Hamas and Hezbollah, but glorifying acts of terrorism that take place in a regular way in the campus community, in the public squares, etc., of Canada, which is why in that article that I referenced, it referred to my own city, Montreal, as the capital of anti-Semitism in Canada, if not in the world.
But why? What is the ingredients, or what is happening that specifically in Canada, of all the countries, always a country very tolerant, very diverse, very accepting, is this happening there now, where we're seeing such violence, such chaos, and so many, I would even say even more so, violent acts of anti-Semitism. This isn't, just a swastika here or a swastika there. There's gunshots, there's explosive devices at synagogues, at people are afraid, obviously, to walk around with kippahs. And I refer to that article that you mentioned before that appears on the Free Press website, which is very, a really good article to read. but talking to rabbis, Rabbi Adam Shire, I think it was from Montreal, who says he can't walk around with a kippah anymore, and after 20 years of living in Canada. What is it about Canada?
Well, if I spoke as you spoke now about synagogues being torched and schools being attacked, and let's say Holocaust memorials being desecrated, and Jews being attacked in their neighborhoods and in their streets and the campus community in the public square, et cetera, you would say, yes, we read about that in Terry Glavin's article, et cetera. But I wrote about that in the aftermath of May 2021, if you remember the Hamas attacks against Israel. And I mentioned this because in my report as first kind of special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, after my first year, I reported that the most important finding that I had of all the major findings was the increasing normalizing, mainstreaming, legitimation of anti-Semitism in the popular community and popular culture, the political culture, the sports culture, the entertainment culture, the media culture, and in particular, the campus culture. And I said, with the absence of outrage, accompanied indeed by indifference and inaction. And I think it was that type of indifference and inaction, the absence of outrage in the run-up to October 7th, while this anti-Semitism was already being mainstream. It then exploded on October 7th, but we had normalized and gotten used to it even before October 7th. And then, I called for a national emergency summit to combat anti-Semitism, and Canada became the first country to hold that. That was in July 2021. But while that summit was important, we did not act in the aftermath of that summit. I proposed then a 10-point action plan. And while the summit was important in and of itself because it was called, the action that was necessary then and that is even more necessary now has yet to be taken.
Does this have to do at all with immigration to Canada, in a country that has long accepted immigrants from around the world? And we've seen an increase, for example, of Muslim or North African immigrants to Canada over the years?
It's not so much, Canada's always been a welcoming country for immigrants, and we've, referred to ourselves as being a nation of immigrants. The problem has been the admission of so many immigrants without proper vetting, without proper effective appreciation of who is coming into this Canada. And we have found amongst those who have been now even arrested and charged with terrorism offenses that they had passed screening tests and had passed a Canadian Border Agency. The real problem here has been the manner in which there's been an absence of vetting and the large numbers that have been admitted of such a character that it was impossible to do effective vetting, as immigration officials have themselves acknowledged. So it's been the combination of unprecedented numbers being admitted without the proper and effective vetting of those numbers, which has resulted in people coming in who should never have been admitted to begin with. I recall years ago when I was the guest of the Syrian Canadian Foundation, and the audience was entirely of Syrian refugees who had been admitted to Canada. And afterwards, they came up to me and they said, we're very happy to be admitted to Canada, but we have to tell you that there are others whom you've admitted who threatened us when we were in Syria and are now threatening us here in Canada. And so I think that's the real problem with regard to immigration and refugee status.
In some of the press reports that have come, media reports that have come out about the events just a week or two ago in Montreal, was the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, who, I say this more jokingly, was recently referred to as a governor by the President-elect Donald Trump. Whatever, that's a whole other story. We're not going to get into that. But he was a bit slow to come out and condemn and make a statement of real consequence regarding what had happened. I know that you come from similar political backgrounds as Justin Trudeau from the same Liberal Party, rank. But what is your take on how he's handled this?
Well, I remember that matter very well because it was a NATO 20th a NATO assembly. There was a parliamentary assembly meeting in Montreal. We were hosting some of the guests from that parliamentary assembly, and you had an explosion of anti-Semitism outside the headquarters of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I won't go into all the violence that was taking place, but then you had the reporting in a split screen where the violence was being shown and the kind of anti-Semitic demonstrations, etc. And at the same time, on the other half of the split screen, you had Trudeau attending a Taylor Swift concert in Vancouver at the time, and the combination really of that, the Prime Minister attending the concert, and while these massive anti-Semitic and violent demonstrations were going on, did promote reaction and even outrage among some. Now, you can't blame the Prime Minister for having been at a concert when he wasn't knowing that these anti-Semitic demonstrations took place. But it took, almost a day before he tweeted a condemnation. And in fact, the real problem is the issue of action. I met with the Prime Minister. I met with him, in fact, 2 weeks ago, and we discussed a number of things. One was the dangers of transnational repression and assassination. I said, look, Canada is going to be hosting the G7. You have to put this as a priority on the agenda. But my second item was a matter of the explosion of anti-Semitism. And I used that term. And I said, what we need now is action. And I called them to bring together federal, provincial, and municipal leaders in a summit, an action summit at this point. Because what we have is that the governments are operating in silos when they have to be operating together. Ministers in the same government in Canada are justice, foreign affairs, public safety, also operating in silos. And I say this as a former minister, you need to work, particularly when you have these kinds of situations. And where the Canadian Association of Chief of Police reported last August that they simply can't keep up with the number of demonstrations, that they don't have neither the moral leadership nor the financial support from the governments to be able to deal with these massive demonstrations. So this creates a kind of a culture of impunity, and this only incentivizes more anti-Semitic demonstrations and the like. And so that's what I try to convey to the Prime Minister in our conversation.
Irwin, you're a young man of 84 years old, and you were born in Montreal. So you've spent a long time there, and you've seen how the country has evolved over more than 80 decades. I mean, I'm guessing this is obviously the worst it has been for the Jewish population and the Jewish people of Canada. But practically speaking, I mean, there will be those who will say stop immigration. There are those who will, you're always going to have people on the far right who are going to say deport the bad people, right? You see the similar conversations taking place, for example, in the United States right now. More education is what people want, more awareness, more government. You have practical recommendations, obviously more collaborative operations by, like you said, the municipalities and the different states, et cetera. But what else can be done, really practically speaking?
Well, I think, what we've had a dramatic rise, as you quoted at the beginning, in anti-Semitism. But more than that, we've had a dramatic rise in hate speech and hate crimes. For example, in the first 3 months after October 7th, we had 10 times as many hate crimes as we had in all of 2022. Canadian Jews are the target of 80% of religiously motivated hate crimes, while we represent only 1% of the population. I can go on. That means that what you need is an action plan for the combating of hate crimes. And we have a situation now, and I say this as a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, there's no absence of criminal code legislation and acts, whether it be public mischief or counseling to commit an offense or I can go through. Yet people are not being arrested in sufficient numbers, and if they are arrested, are not being prosecuted, or if they're being prosecuted, and that too, as I said, is not taking place. You don't have enough determinations of responsibility. So we have a failure of law enforcement, and that failure is because we don't have moral clarity coming from the political leadership of all these governments that I mentioned, not just moral clarity, but providing appropriate direction and calling upon the law enforcement to implement these criminal code provisions, etc. I think, as the Canadian Social and Police Chief said, they want to do it, but they don't have the moral clarity. They don't have the financial resources. They are overstretched, as they put it. Even if we wanted to engage in effective law enforcement, we're not able to do that. And so this requires, as I say, effective leadership grounded not only in moral clarity. We need the appropriate moral condemnations, but we need it in terms of providing the effective resources as part of the effective leadership. And I'm giving only one example with regard to anti-Semitic hate crimes.
You've also, I mean, you've been very outspoken recently on the ICC and ICJ and the way that they've taken Israel to the arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Gallant, but also the ICJ accusations and proceedings on genocide charges. I mean, this also, do you think that people fully understand that when you have these courts or judicial processes that are being led, I would say also maybe partially due to anti-Semitism, if not mostly due to anti-Semitism, this also feeds into what's happening on the streets of places like Montreal?
No question about it. This was also a subject of my discussions with the Prime Minister, because he had issued a statement on the occasion of the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. And he said, well, Canada, as you know, is a founder of the ICC, and we have to respect the decisions of the ICC. This led to inferences being drawn that Canada would immediately arrest Netanyahu. He didn't say that, but as I said, it was an inference drawn from his statement. When I met with him, I said, not only is that inference drawn, but I think you should have gone the other way. I said, yes, Canada is a supporter of the ICC. And yes, I've been a long-time supporter and been involved with the ICC, etc. In fact, I supported Karim Khan for his candidacy as special prosecutor, as did Canada. And that's what's so disturbing in all this, because the special prosecutor, Karim Khan, in asking for these arrest warrants, was himself breaching, as did the pre-trial chamber, and breaching foundational principles of the ICC, principles of complementarity, where the ICC is not supposed to substitute its judgment for that of a judiciary in a robust democracy like this. When I'm using Karim Khan's words, he personally described to me that Israel has a robust judiciary and the like. Second of all, even if he felt that Israel has not yet acted, he asked, and I facilitated a meeting with him and the Israeli leadership on May 20th. And on the day that was to take place, and in fact, when the ICC team was supposed to take off from the airport for the meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I happened to have been in Israel at the time, I'd arranged to have dinner with Karim Khan on his arrival in Israel. He, in a preemptive way, canceled the trip and called for arrest warrants, breaching his own principle of cooperation. And one last thing about that. A month before, he had gone to Venezuela, and under the principle of cooperation, because he met with Maduro, decided not to issue arrest warrants against Maduro, whose dictatorship had dismantled any vestige of an independent legal process in Venezuela, and had arrested opposition candidates on the way to the election in Venezuela. But he was prepared to go ahead and call for arrest warrants regarding Netanyahu. So when I mentioned this to him, he said, well, Irwin, no one is above the law. I said, you're right. No one is above the law, but the law has to be respected, and you have to have respect for equality before the law. And this gets to the point, and I had to do this, the preface may be too long, to what you said. One of the real problems, and I mentioned this to the Prime Minister, and one of my findings as a special envoy was the danger of the laundering of anti-Semitism under the protective cover of the UN, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, under the very rubric of anti-racism itself. That's what gives all these anti-Semitic demonstrations in a public square, in a campus square, a veneer of legitimacy and even incentivizing those acts.
And by the way, I mean, we talk about the ICC, Bashar al-Assad, who has now fled to Moscow. Well, there's no ICC warrant against him for all the bad things that he's done over the years, but, put that aside. Irwin, I want to ask you in the time that's left. I mean, a few weeks ago, a couple months ago, you got disturbing news that you had been under threat from the Iranians for over a year now. There had been a plot to target you over your strong stance that you've taken on Tehran and on their human rights abuses and writings that you have published against the Iranian regime, the regime of the Ayatollahs. I mean, can you walk us through how did this happen? How did they notify you, and how has this changed things for you?
Well, I remember directly on November 14th, 2023, in the wake of a mass atrocity, October 7th, my wife and I were coming back from Washington. As we arrived in Trudeau Airport in Montreal, we were told not to leave by the RCMP. They were going to meet with us, did so, and advised us then that they had credible evidence of an imminent and lethal threat to my life, as they put it. I did not know the source of the threat at the time. Ironically enough, I had an op-ed published almost at the same time in the Globe and Mail before I knew of that threat, where I was warning of transnational repression and assassination and attributing that to Iran. There was another big story in the Globe and Mail on around December 4th. I was then asked to comment on it. It became public for the first time. I said, no comment. At the beginning of 2025, I learned that Iran was the source of that plot. I still did not make any public comments. On April 26th, I'm supposed to attend the 60th anniversary of my McGill Law graduating class, and I was advised that day that they had evidence of an imminent and lethal threat within the next 48 hours. And so I did not go, but then the story broke. I had not said anything about it on November 18th in a front page story, well-sourced in the Globe and Mail, one of the kind of national newspapers, by the Ottawa Bureau Chief Robert Fife. The next day, and again, I still hadn't commented, both houses of the Canadian Parliament unanimously passed a resolution condemning the assassination attempt and expressing solidarity with me. It was only then, after that, and other stories breaking internationally, that I then agreed to comment, and then the matter went public with my own comments affirming the authoritativeness of the reports.
Why you?
Well, I've been active, going back to my years in as a parliamentarian. I condemned, as a matter of fact, the Ayatollah Khamenei, who began the 21st century on January 3rd, I remembered, saying that there can be no resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state. He didn't even use the euphemism Zionist regime. I called then for him and the others who have been saying the same thing about Israel being a cancer to be held to account. Later in 2008, for example, I called then for the IRGC to be put on the terrorist list. It took until 2024 until it was put on the terrorist list. Under a motion I unanimously recommended and adopted by the Canadian Parliament, we have set aside September 1st as Iranian Political Prisoner Day, etc. And I founded the annual Iranian Accountability Week, again going back to 2008, bringing together parliamentarians, NGOs, civil society leaders, and leaders of the Iranian diaspora for an annual accounting. So I've been very much engaged, and really what's so disturbing here has not only been the Iranian patterns of transnational repression and assassination, but the absence of sufficient solidarity with the Iranian people. As I've always said, my actions were really pro-Iranian, pro the Iranian people. It's the Iranian regime that has to be held to account, and regrettably, their actions for all these years have been attended by a culture of impunity.
Wow. And changing in terms of security, that I'm guessing has all just now been part of the regular norm of life for you and Ariella.
It's been part of the normal life, but we go about our life as normally as we can. I have, and our family has had excellent protection. There has been a lowering of the level of protection in the last few weeks. I'm not sure the reason or source for that, but that's also a reality, and I welcomed it because I felt they were being too burdened to have to protect us. But as I said, we've gone about our life as normally as we can. Don't pay attention to it, because part of what the Iranian regime wants to do is to, by targeting people, silence them, intimidate them, etc. So I've maintained the same level of advocacy as before.
Well, we commend you on that. And Irwin, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for everything that you do. And to our viewers and our listeners, thank you so much for being with us. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom, a good weekend. You can find us, as always, on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and of course on the website of the Times of Israel.